technical glitch. We were discussing Sam Bankman-Fried, and I just read Michael Lewis's new book, Rony, and it mentions in his home they didn't celebrate birthdays. They
Right.
didn't seem to have much loyalty to tradition and to normal observances that most people do to kind of shape meaning and morality.
Right.
So, any reflections on that and possible significance?
Well, of course, given the work that I began as their fellow conservative claims of cultural oppression, and the memoir that then wrote in the same spirit about them, obviously, my tendency is going to be to view them through that lens, and therefore to view that as confirmation of the worldview, of the viewpoint that I articulated. So, acknowledging that kind of motivated cognition on my part, nevertheless, I will say that it is consistent with my description of the liberal elite culture as elitist, not necessarily in the crude sense imputed by conservatives, but it's still in a human sense where they have this privileged naturalistic scientific perspective on the world, where they can distinguish between brute reality, actual reality, and these sort of artificial, contrived, and potentially, you know, dangerous human meanings that have been arbitrarily projected upon them. I discussed that quite a bit in the third chapter of conservative claims, and one could see their disdain of birthdays in in that light. There's no reason to think that you know such a day would has any real objective special significance for our lives. Just as they would say that as of the Sabbath for Judaism, or Sunday for Christianity, or the Wailing Wall, or various holidays of all religions. They would just say this is just a point in maybe not Newtonian but Einsteinian space time, and that's all it is. And so, as you could see there, disdain of birthdays, um, you know, as an affirmation, I guess, of that elitism. And I could say that I mean, people, and there's sort of one thing I emphasize in the book is that this kind of these pretenses to scientific sophistication as an expression of an identity is something over and above mere enlightenment. It's an affirmation of an identity. So I kind of feel like on some level, yeah, I do feel the arbitrariness of special days and places. I'm kind of weird as well, I think, in that regard, but I don't go out of my way to disdain them. I'm perfectly fine having a yeah, great, it's Thanksgiving, or whatever the case may be. I don't make a it's not immensely important to me, but I don't make if I was in an environment where that would be the natural thing to do, I would do it. It's not I wouldn't make an issue of it. And if you're like a family growing up in Palo Alto, you have kids, it'd be a natural thing to do to want to have a birthday party for your kid. You can invite their friends, you can give out candy, you can play games. You would want to affirm that just for that reason alone, notwithstanding the arbitrariness.
So,
But
so
yeah, they couldn't go with the flow.
right. So there's a line between the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and Barbara Fried and Joe Bankman not celebrating birthdays. My own father, who had two PhDs, saw no significance really in birthdays or Christmas
Yeah,
either. So there seems to be a straight line, this secularized, reformist Protestant tendency, once
right.
secularized, is that you increasingly do away with anything special about any particular day.
Right, these Protestant tendencies, which certainly had some role in Catholicism as well. How could they not? But that generally created this sense of hierarchy. There are those who can distinguish the objective and the subjective, and there are those who cannot. And that's the hierarchy that developed in that context, and that is ultimately the hierarchy to which conservative claims of cultural oppression are objecting. Certainly, in my conflict with them, it was again, I wasn't like making the productivity that was expected. I think kind of saw me as like dreamy and in my own world, and I wasn't rooted in that rigid dichotomy for them in a fairly refined way in the academic context. But again, wherever you go, whether it be the burning of the American flag, the celebration, which I also discuss in the book, the celebration of birthdays, as I've just learned from you. Again, I think that's kind of the most you can explain the most things from that starting point, which I discuss in the book. More than it's not going to explain everything, but I think a lot more than most other starting points.
Right. And so what are the moral weaknesses, or what are the hazards? Where can this type of buffered strategic autonomous reflexive enlightenment, strong believing in rationality and the inherent goodness of people, where is this where are the dangers in this kind of outlook on life? One that comes to mind for me, particularly among academics, is that you become so enthralled by the abstract world in which you live that you lose touch with the repercussions of your abstractions on flesh and blood people.
You lose touch, and one of the reasons why you can't uh, envision the repercussions being what they may turn out to be is that you don't see that this dichotomy we've just been discussing between so there's the world as it is, the artificial socially constructed meetings that are superimposed on them, and they say, well, we can distinguish the two, but they don't see, I think, that the very act of distinguishing the two, of positioning yourself as someone who does distinguish the two, is you don't see that very distinction, that very affirmation of the distinction, is itself a manifestation of what I call in the book, in both books, um, a hero system. That is to say, it's kind of to be Hegelian, I guess. Yes, it sets itself in opposition to this ostensibly cruder, less sophisticated, primitive, pre-modern way of looking at things, but it doesn't see that this very setting itself apart is itself a kind of a permutation on this primitivism. That's something Nietzsche says. Yeah, we always see ourselves as more civilized, but this is a concealing of the same underlying impulses towards cruelty and distinction and hierarchy that we believe ourselves to have overcome. And I think so. Obviously, in my memoir, I detail how I think that played out in my relationship to them. But in the case of the FTX fiasco, I think it's maybe their failure to recognize the extent to which their egos were invested in uh, all of their decisions. And I mean, I read some of the reproduced emails in the complaint, and I you kind of see like Barbara talking about how you should structure these gifts to her pack, or or Joe talking about how to structure these gifts to Stanford. You can see they are like relishing in their purported acumen and circumspection, and you can do this, but there's this complication, you do that, there's that complication. So they are relishing in the buffered distance, their awareness of their entire social worlds, unlike the primitives. But they could not see, by virtue of that, the the big picture, the way their own hero systems were driving them. Barbara to be a savior of imperiled Democratic candidates. Uh, Joe to be a great benefactor of Stanford. Barbara as well in that regard, I would assume. And just the to be the cruder pleasure of having a really nice mansion in the Bahamas with unobstructed ocean views for $16 million. They couldn't see how all those things were working themselves out, because they had this image of themselves which they instilled, reproduced in their children, who then reaffirmed their self image, and well, we know how it all panned out.
So, one thing you're saying is that no matter how reflexive, strategic, autonomous, and buffered an identity we develop, we never get to graduate from the very human need for ever increasing our status.
I think so. I mean, that's in the end. We're all kids on the playground in the end, but just like you know, in the same way that modern warfare is ultimately an exceedingly sophisticated development on primitive warfare, where the basic continuity is there. So generally with human beings, we still have these underlying impulses with which we evolve, and they can take astonishingly complex form, which can apparently easily fool the limitations of human conscious awareness. But they're ultimately continuous with these primitive impulses we might not want to acknowledge.
And we also never get to graduate from the very human tendency to dismiss those who are different from us as less than human.
Yeah, I mean that is going to it can take various forms. In primitive societies, it required no justification at all, or hardly any. You just like label them a certain way, and that's it. As societies develop in sophistication, you have to find rationalizations for that. I mean, you can think of obvious example would be scientific racism in the West, because the economic benefits of slavery were increasing just as the appeal of Enlightenment principles were increasing, and they had to find a way to reconcile that. So, and it can get far more refined than that. And at the most refined level, that's I think what I discuss in the book. The very kind of I guess sophisticated form of snobbery one finds among the academic elites, which is has plausible deniability at every turn, for sure, but which is nevertheless readily sensed by conservatives, and exists on some level, not necessarily in the way conservatives understand it, but there's a grain of truth there.
Okay, anything else you want to hit on Sam Bankman-Fried's story before we move on to the Middle East?
I think that's it. Once we have a jury verdict, I think we can revisit this issue.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Okay, so it was 2 weeks and 1 day ago that I woke up and heard about a horrifying massacre of Israeli civilians, more than 1,400 on October 7th in southern Israel. About 250 now have been taken captive by Hamas, and Israel's massing for a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. For the first time, of which I'm aware, an American president has gone to a war zone, and just extraordinary decision it seemed to be for Joe Biden to go to Israel and embrace Bibi and essentially make this war between Israel and Hamas now look like another American proxy war. So we've already got one American proxy war going on in Ukraine, where the United States has rallied NATO to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Now we have the appearance of another U.S. proxy war with Israel versus Hamas. So much to talk about here. Rony, what have you been thinking about with regard to this conflict?
Well, quite a bit. I mean, I've been glued to YouTube and the various websites I look to. I called my aunt on Tuesday, who lives in Zichron Yaakov, which is where my mom used to live when she was alive, and I lived there a few years. So as I expected, because of where they live, which is kind of in the middle between Haifa and Tel Aviv, they weren't affected. My cousin, he got called up for reserve duty, but they let him go after a few days because he was he was a combat soldier, but like an animal trainer. He would like an animal. He would handle the the bomb sniffing dogs and so forth. But they didn't have a dog for him, so they released him. So nobody in the family is going to get is entering Gaza. I know that. Though they could certainly, if Hezbollah enters the fray, they are certainly they can get hit. I was actually in Israel in 2006 during the Second Lebanon War, and so in a law program in Haifa, we got rocketed by Hezbollah, so we had to move to Jerusalem. But where my mom lived at the time was out of rocket range. But today that has changed. Today they can probably hit pretty much anywhere. So it's a frightening situation. I mean, obviously, from my point of view, having family there, I'm reassured to have those two, aircraft carriers there. I think any U.S. involvement should be a last resort, but their presence is not itself intrinsically harmful. Though, I mean, certainly I would critique Joe Biden on certain fronts, because my view is that obviously there's going to be retribution. There's no escaping that. But that's not an excuse for Israel to revert to medieval Mongolian steppe rider level of humanitarian ethics. So even though Biden did counsel restraint on certain levels, I think he should have been more vocal about the certainly the initial blockade of like food, water, electricity, everything. I think I think certainly Israel is excessive in that regard, and I think maybe he did behind the scenes. Maybe Biden intervened behind the scenes, or is going to, or isn't now. So I would have preferred more urging of caution there.
Now, what about the trip itself? I can't imagine any other American politician flying to Israel so quickly, and except for perhaps Donald Trump, because it just seems like such a gigantic act of hubris. And it also seems to me to tie into the liberal enlightenment frame of mind that the world is largely knowable, that we can just apply our reason, that we can be strategic, and that we can conduct not just ethical promiscuous sex, we can conduct, ethical promiscuous wars. And to me, for the president of the United States to fly to Israel at a time like this and to embrace Israel the way that Joe Biden has done is just the height of irresponsibility as regard to America's best interests, and it reflects a hubris that depends upon a post-enlightenment, belief in the great power of reason to stir up this hornet's nest with the idea that you can then manage the hornet's nest, or that you are so assured of your ability to contribute to managing this hornet's nest that you would go fly into the middle of the hornet's nest. While from a trad perspective, I don't have nearly as much power in reason, and I don't have nearly as much power that these kind of primal embodied emotions can be managed. I think they're very likely to escape the leash of reason, and so from a trad perspective, I just have a much more tragic perspective on the human condition, and I'd be much less liable to think that the United States can manage the Ukraine war. Just like, I'll go on for another minute here. Lyndon Baines Johnson would decide what targets would be bombed in North Vietnam. I mean, this is another example of this belief in reason and power to successfully manage and strategically, autonomously, decide we'll bomb here and we'll bomb here, but we won't bomb here. And then the Biden administration, they decide on which munitions they give to Ukraine so as to not exacerbate the situation, but enable Ukraine to defend itself. And they won't give cluster bombs, and then they give cluster bombs, and they won't give tanks, but then they give tanks, and they won't give jets, but they'll do this. It just seems to be, from a trad perspective, an astonishing amount of hubris to think that you can stage manage through the power of your reason such, primal life and death, embodied experiences by millions of people. To me, it's an exact analogy to liberal college campuses having policies of affirmative consent. So when you are starting to have an intimate relation with someone, you're supposed to get affirmative consent. So you get consent to kiss her, you get consent to French kiss her, you get consent to unbutton her blouse, you get consent to massage her chest, you get consent to remove her brassiere, you get consent to remove her pants, you get consent to touch her between her legs, you get consent to enter her. And if any time while you're entering her, she decides no, then even if you're 10 seconds away from orgasm, you are expected to immediately desist. And from a trad perspective, once you stop playing with these kind of primal emotions, these sort of sexual interactions outside of marriage, or you stop playing with these primal emotions of war, the primal feelings, the embodied experience of the people involved are very likely to overwhelm the best intentions of the most rational, ethical approach. So I'm highly suspicious of ethical approaches to promiscuity in both sex and in war. Any thoughts?
Well, so first of all, as just the question of affirmative consent, I'm sure you recall, I actually discuss all that for quite a number of pages as another expression of the buffer distance, the hubris of reason in the present context. Now Biden could have, if the goal was deterrence, if he had kept the carriers, in the Western Mediterranean or not, or the Central Mediterranean, not right off the coast of Lebanon, and if sort of he had, privately warned Iran, don't get involved, don't involve Hezbollah, that still would have been like as effective. Like, it didn't need to be this huge public display. Now, the question of whether he should have done even what I was suggesting, that's another issue that can be debated. But the point is that if the goal was to deter other fronts, that could have been achieved much less performatively with, I guess, much less of a risk of heating up passions in the manner you've described and generating all these unintended and unforeseeable uh, consequences. Um, there is, even though Joe Biden is not an evangelical, one of these evangelical Christians, like is the defend Israel at all costs for the second coming and all that. Even so, there is I kind of agree when you put it all together, his statements, his arrival, the aircraft carriers. Um, it's there is a certain sort of evangelical apocalyptic thinking, even though it's not acknowledged, it's not explicit. Everything is put in secular terms, but it is like if there needs to be a final battle, so there will be, and I mean, it's they have said that that certainly doesn't the U.S. reaction to Israel discredit the U.S. with respect to Ukraine. I mean, at the end of the day, Israel is not, notwithstanding the Palestinian successes on October 7th. They're not the underdog. There's a certain meaning in Biden going to Kiev to support, the underdog. We have your back, whereas Israel, at the end of the day, they got control of the borders. At the end of the day, they completely, overpower Hamas. The fact that there's no need for that show of support alters its meaning and its resonance for the Arab world. I think that's for sure.
So, do you believe that there is some sort of connection with belief in post Enlightenment rationality and the power of reason and the power of strategy? And Joe Biden, like Lyndon Baines Johnson, thinks that he can micromanage all these different wars. Is that an example of the chutzpah of the liberal Buffett identity?
I mean, I don't. This you could. I mean, you could find. I don't know how much of it I would chalk up to the Buffett identity, just because I mean, you have plenty of people's attitudes I could also chalk up to the Buffett identities, who are going to be pro Palestinian, and they have their own understanding of reason, which is seeing through this Eurocentric simulacrum of reason, and that has its excesses too, such as celebrating the Hamas attacks. So I mean. The Buffett identity has, can have in different contexts, it can have more or fewer, permutations. I
But I'm
think
talking
that,
about the power of reason. All right. From a trad perspective, we have less belief in the power of reason to micromanage such primal conflicts as these sort of wars. Isn't that a much more of a liberal orientation to think that you can micromanage these type of wars?
yeah, I mean, I don't, I don't know enough to to assess what how certain Biden is of how much of the extent to which he can control things. I mean, there was certainly the need for a performance on on his part, which dichotomizes this Manichaean, the civilized versus the barbarian. I did see that. You know what level of hubris Is he, in his own predictive power and ability to control? Was he manifesting by sending two aircraft carriers? I'm not sure about that. I'm not. Maybe you're right. I'm not sure.
Okay, have you heard of a man named Tom Landry? He was
I
a
haven't.
football coach. Okay, he was a football
Okay.
coach of the Dallas Cowboys,
All
and
right.
he was of mainstream Protestant heritage, and he was the very stone-faced and the opposite of showy, explicitly. But he always had to use these trick plays in the playoffs and the Super Bowl to try to show off how smart he was. And one observer said Chuck Noll, who coached the rival Pittsburgh Steelers to 4 Super Bowl victories in the 70s, he just wanted to win Super Bowls. Tom Landry, it was equally important to him to be seen as a very smart man. And
Right.
and I think you see that in Joe Biden and in Donald Trump. These guys are so similar to each other in that they have a desperate need to be seen as important and on the ground and making changes. I remember in 1985, I read an article in the New Republic by Britt Hume, who was then a correspondent for ABC News, and it was called "Shut Up, Senator Biden." Because Senator Biden, for 5 decades, has had a reputation for being a motor mouth with a vast, over exaggerated sense of his own
Mhm.
capabilities. And I just think about, people like Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Tom Landry, all these ways of trying to show off how smart they are. I mean, Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan, could very well have precipitated some, major military conflict between the United States and China. But
Right.
the human desire for self-aggrandizement and for status will individuals like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Donald Trump will seemingly put the whole future of the planet at risk to try to advance in status. It's just it's something you can't escape. This
Yeah.
human need for status. Go ahead.
And I guess you can see sort of the maybe the pettiest expression of that lately. So yeah, there was a whole controversy over whether Hamas had decapitated 40 babies. you know,
Yeah.
uh, that report came out, and I mean, certainly it seems like they may have decapitated some people. They certainly killed some infants and children in gruesome ways. Whether 40 babies got decapitated, that's kind of an open question. But it was put out there by a right wing settler, and the left critiqued it, for inflaming tensions, and at the end of the day, to my knowledge, the official IDF itself did not confirm it. So I don't think that's literally the case. But Biden said like he had seen pictures of this in one
And
of
then
his.
his office retracted that and said he hadn't seen
Later on, they
pictures.
did. Yeah, they had to. Right. So yeah, that's nuts. That sort of the president of the United States inserts himself into this very unhelpful social media, misinformation.
Yeah.
I mean, it does no good at all, because at the end of the day, then like it's like it's used by Hamas sympathizers to because that particular account is doubtful. Yeah, they will seize on that to suggest that maybe no atrocities of any kind happened. Total nonsense as well. So that was completely unhelpful, and yet he did it. Biden, when I look at his face, I mean, it's kind of it's blank in some ways. So even though I agree your hypothesis, hubris and arrogance, overweening confidence in the power of reason, yeah, it explains some things, but like I'm not sure what exactly going on in Biden's mind, even though I don't think he's been that bad of a president. I've agreed with his stance on Ukraine, and I think domestically, could have been worse, in these times. But
Well, I'm still living with the pain as a Dallas Cowboys fan in the 1979 Super Bowl against the Steelers. They were running the ball so effectively in their opening drive, and then Tom Landry had to call a triple reverse where the Cowboys fumbled and the Steelers took over and they just won the game 35-31. But
right,
he couldn't be content with just running the ball. And Joe Biden just frequently, and Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi and so many, and Sam Bankman-Fried and Joe Bankman and Barbara Fried and Luke Ford and I'm sure Ronnie Guldmann at time. As part of our human condition, we can't just be content with running the ball. We always have to try that triple reverse and, just as often as not, fumble the ball and, the hubris that is just
yeah.
part of the human
Look,
condition.
I mean, in and I acknowledge it in the memoir. It, it was hubris. It was my own hubris that created, the entire situation, and on some level, for better or worse. Let's hope for better, but it created it. Um, yeah, so no, that is there. And I don't know what Joe Biden is thinking. I mean,
No,
we'll
but
we,
what we
we'll
can
see what
do
happens.
is see his choices and make deductions from there. But one of the great parts of your book that introduced me to the idea of hero systems. We all have a hero system. So Hamas terrorists who were slaughtering Israeli citizens did not think that they were doing a bad thing. Thought they were doing the will of God or the fulfilling the imperatives of their people, gaining vengeance and justice on a people who had so viciously oppressed them.
Right.
Can you articulate the hero system of those who slaughtered Israeli civilians, those who didn't think they were doing bad things, those who thought they were doing good things, just like I'm sure many Nazis believed they were doing good things by gassing Jews, and I'm sure many of the Hamas terrorists had a particular hero system that valorized what they were doing to Israeli civilians. Can you elucidate?
Yeah, well, and I mean, also, I mean, there were times during the 48 war and the Israeli War of Independence and through to the 50s, where you did have Israeli military slaughtering a lot of civilians in a manner, Palestinians, you know, in a manner not so different from what we saw from Hamas, and that's not just Palestinian propaganda. It's also been acknowledged by the Israeli government. These things did happen. I think maybe the extent is exaggerated by the Palestinians, but it's not the sort of thing that would emanate only from the Palestinians. Hero systems. It can assume many forms, and one of the advantages of having uh, power is that you can conceal your hero system, or at least conceal the damage you're willing to create on behalf of a hero system. And I would, again, so when I talk about in the book, it's saying conservatives see symmetry where liberals see asymmetry, meaning that liberals believe they've sort of categorically extricated themselves from this pre-modern condition into which conservatives remain mired, and the conservative objections that no, you're sort of implicated in the same thing. It's just kind of subtler and more sophisticated. And I think analogously to that, well, what is Hamas going to say? They're going to say, yeah, okay, you Israelis, you don't go door to door slaughtering civilians, even though notwithstanding the misconduct of the settlers in the West Bank, but you did, at one time to a certain extent, under certain, conditions where you felt it was necessary to your vital interests, necessary to your hero system, that being the establishment of the state of Israel. And we, in the end, yeah, we do things which you're not going to do today. You're going to drop a bomb. We can only do so much damage to the military, but in the end, again, the Hamas sees, like conservatives, analogously to conservatives, they see symmetry between themselves and the Israelis, where the Israelis see asymmetry. I mean, I guess you can say that to graft the book onto the situation, it's sort of the Israelis who, to the extent they're more moral, they're able to be more moral because of their power position. Conservatives see that as a privilege of the Zionist hero system, and there were nothing they really need to take account of.
Yeah, as someone coming from an Anglo-Saxon upbringing, I'm often shocked and appalled by the ethical shortcuts that ethnics will take. That many of my ethnic friends, from Asian to Armenian to Jewish or to Persian, or they'll do all sorts of ethical shortcuts that I would never dream of doing. So I had one girlfriend who, when her family left a tip for a waiter, she'd raid the tip and put it in her own pocket. Or they would feel, much more at ease with, putting various things down on paperwork that were not true, right. Collaborating to cheat on tests, all sorts of things would be highly frowned upon in the Anglo-Saxon tradition.
Right.
Any thoughts on these different hero systems?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's something, again, I don't know if you call it the Anglo-Saxon hero system or, the Western European heroes. I mean, there were obviously, I guess, psychological changes in people's sense of themselves that allowed societies to see corruption as a problem and not just, part of, normal human relationships. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. I mean, you have to see see the world in a certain very impersonal way, I guess, to internalize these norms, as some cultures have, more than others. I guess, whether, I think it's probably, at the end of the day, probably, I mean, it's probably more fine grained and more complex than crude designation of ethnic groups, might indicate. But obviously, you have certain practices that have taken, deeper root in certain parts of the world than others, for all sorts of historical and economic reasons.
Now, one thing that's interesting about the news coverage of the Middle East is how, and elite discussion of it, and American foreign policy in general, and I guess it's because America's a classically liberal nation, is it's so moralized. Now, the way America acts is usually brutally realistic. So we entered late into 2 world wars and just, somewhat mopped them up and got all the benefits, while, other nations, lost millions and millions of people. So we're often brutally realistic in our choices, but the rhetoric we use is liberal universalist. And so much of the discussion around the Arab-Israeli conflict is all about who's more moral and who's more legitimate. And I just don't participate in this. I'm purely interested in the in the realistic assumption of like who can hold what land, and who can, who's going to have to give up what land.
Yeah.
Does the moralistic dimension of rhetoric in general about American foreign policy, and particularly about the Middle East conflict, is that something that's unique to the Anglo world, the First World, to America? Does it jar you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would think that the American discourse on Israel, whether that of the left or the right, is certainly, more moralistic than you could find among, a number of historical Israeli leaders. So, obviously, you know, there's sort of a range of views. You take like the Ben Shapiro conservatives. They see any acknowledgement of Israeli transgressions against Palestinians as just beyond the pale and a pretext for terrorism, exceedingly moralistic in responding to that. But the fact is that you go back all the way into the founding to the present day, and you take a bunch of look at tough-minded Israeli leaders, generals, Mossad heads, all these people. They have kind of said in a very non-moralistic way a lot of the same things that the moralistic left says in its moralistic fashion. So Moshe Dayan, great general of Israel, said of Gaza, after Israel got independence, well, how could they not hate us? They used to live out here in these nice villages. Now they're cooped up as a result of us. They are now cooped up in this urban hellhole. How could they, looking on, not hate us? And you've got plenty of other examples of former Shin Bet chiefs saying we either we are an apartheid state or we're sort of becoming that. But so you can find all of these acknowledgments among Israeli heads of states and various luminaries. And the difference is that when they say these things, to their mind, they're that's how the sausage gets made. They can acknowledge the historical realities without getting moralistic. They have this historical perspective that say that's how the U.S. was created. That's how Australia was created through these various transgressions against the indigenous people. So the Israeli leadership is not at all moralistic, but in the context of the U.S., yeah, you get every party gets very much so.
Yeah, and I would have no problem understanding the establishment of the state of Israel as being accomplished in large part through ethnic cleansing, through deliberate ethnic cleansing, doing everything you can to drive out the Arab and Muslim residents who may have been there for many generations. And the only thing that stopped a complete ethnic cleansing of Arabs from what became the Jewish state of Israel is international outcry. Would you have any quibbles with that?
I mean that's more or less accurate. When I grew up, I mean, I remember as a kid, I didn't live in Israel, but we spoke Hebrew at home. We'd go back there for the summers, and the story I was always told, there was a war. They didn't recognize our right to exist, and then the Arab states, surrounding Arab states, told the Palestinians, get out of there. So we have a clear line of sight. We can shoot the Jews, and once we've done that, you can come back in. And they all, gleefully pounced on that and left to facilitate this Arab invasion. But then they lost, and so why are they not allowed back in? Because they're being punished because they left, not to escape bombs and all these other things, but like solely to hurt Israel. So that's kind of this myth that was there for a while. That was the mainstream Israeli view. Um, that has largely been debunked by Israeli historians. You know, not all of whom are necessarily that left of center. So I mean, there is some debate. I mean, certainly there was during the 48 war there was an intent that it would be a nice thing if we could like get as many of these Palestinians out of here as possible. They didn't necessarily want to kill them, but there was a hope that they would be scared into leaving. There is, disagreement about how explicit these orders were, how centralized the directive was. But yeah, there's disagreement about, well, was this the result of the fact that they didn't recognize Israel as a Jewish state, or was it built into Zionism itself? So there's some measure of disagreement, but certainly this fairy tale that Israelis were traditionally told from the founding until fairly recently is certainly false. And at the end of the day, you could say it was inevitable, because even on the portion of the Palestine mandate which the UN had reserved for the Jews, even there, the Jews were barely over 50% of the population. So they understood there was no way this Jewish state could thrive, you know, absent expulsions. And there had been talk of that for some time. They weren't necessarily sure what exactly they were going to do, but certainly once the Palestinian hostility became evident, they were more than happy to expel as many as they reasonably could. So yeah, I think your characterization is there are caveats we can add maybe, but by and large, I think it's certainly far closer to the truth than the traditional Israeli narrative.
Yeah, and one of the key talking points of Hasbara, meaning pro-Israel propaganda, is that the Jewish state is just a tiny state in the midst of all these different, tens of millions of Arabs who have their own states. There are so many different Arab Muslim states.
Yeah,
What's the matter of this tiny little Jewish state in their midst? And it reminds me of gay marriage. There are comparatively few gay marriages, but as someone, I believe in a traditional heterosexual one man, one woman definition of marriage. So even the
right.
existence of, one gay marriage in California would bother me. It causes me pain. And so too, I understand the sentiments of Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East that they can't make peace with land that they have historical claim to, in addition to the Jewish claims, and can't make peace with the Jewish state that was established in their midst, and their own people were essentially ethnically cleansed from the area. And then you've got this tiny Jewish state, but in their midst, on land that they believe belongs to them. That's just as I can now understand through the help of your book why this is not just a part of their intellectual hero system, but it's something that they embody and feel that's just as real as a punch in the face. That their land and their understanding of how the universe should work has been desecrated, just as my understanding of how the world should work has been desecrated by the existence of gay marriage. Is there anything you can say on this?
I mean, I guess. I mean, that would certainly that would explain the breakdown of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process in Camp David and Tama. But the Israelis thought they were being exceedingly generous in what they were offering, and surely in some regard it wasn't as bad as some Palestinian propagandists were saying. But as far as the full markers of sovereignty. They didn't have the right to really like build their own army or control their own airspace, and Israel would control the Jordan Valley. So I mean, I think like the actual like arrangement, they were getting back most of the land, but again, they still sensed, I think, on a visceral level, a certain Israeli entitlement, and so even though the offer might not have been horrible, but might have been workable. They they couldn't get they still sense that Israeli presumption, and so Arafat, knowing that that's how people would feel, couldn't agree to it. And that same thing goes with the refugees. I mean, that's what really makes you hopeless, because that is such a symbol of what happened in 48 and the competing narratives about what happens, and to so it's so core to the Palestinian cause to vindicate their narrative, their hero system, through the repatriation of the refugees. But that's nothing to which Israel will ever agree. And
Right.
so that's, I mean, right, because that's the death of their hero system.
Right. I mean, you
Um,
could take the nicest man in the world, male to female, transsexual, and if he, came to my synagogue and he wanted to use the female bathroom, I'd be outraged. I would be almost driven to the point of like, physically throwing him out. And that's just because I have a particular hero system that does not believe in male to female transition, and I don't want what someone I view as a mutilated man, going and using a female bathroom in my holy synagogue. And so I can understand the sentiments of the Arabs and the Muslims.
I mean, in their heart of hearts, none of them think Israel has any business existing.
Yeah.
In their heart of hearts, that's for sure. And I have to say, look, philosophically, I can't say their arguments are crazy.
Right.
Can a group after 2,000 years go back and reclaim land that very distant ancestors owned there? So again, like, the Palestinians can invoke this kind of very basic moral common sense. Why should the Germans should compensate you for what they did? Why should we have to bear the brunt, bear the price? So on an abstract philosophical level, you see where they're coming from, and they refuse to compromise on that at some level. Certainly, some of them might begrudgingly agree to some two-state solution. Two-state, might begrudgingly, agree to the Lebanese Palestinian refugees going to Canada or wherever, whatever arrangement might be made for them. They might they might go along with it because at the end of the day, you want to live normal lives. But yeah, in their heart of hearts, they reject it, and by the same token, with the Israelis. So you take the most left wing American wokester. They buy a house somewhere, and some Native American comes back and explains to them, hey, well, my tribe used to live here. They were removed through trickery or force, ethnic cleansing. I want it back. Everything that happened since then was wrong, so you don't really own it. you know you could be the most woke left wing bleeding heart person imaginable. You're not going to give away your title. And I think, like, similarly with Israel, notwithstanding, the Palestinians can come there with their keys and say, my village used to be here, I used to live there. That may be provable and so forth, but I know, like, having lived there, it has become its own society, its own culture. The fact that Israel's crimes are relatively recent compared to a lot of other powers, doesn't change their basic feelings about this, which is that this is Israel, this is my country, and I'm not going to move, and I'm not going to agree to any radical changes that would make this a fully binational state. They're not going to do that for the same reason no human would do that, even if the facts and the arguments are against them.
Yeah, and I'll ask you a question and answer it myself before I throw it to you so you can
Sure.
catch your breath. So the question is Israel an apartheid state? I have no problem. I'm not outraged by that question. I would say, as with most such questions, that there are ways that you can view accurately and fairly view Israel as an apartheid state. And there are many, many ways that you can view Israel as completely different from South Africa, which is the most famous example of
Yeah.
an apartheid state. So I have no problem with the question. I have no problem with the accusation. I would just look to see, okay, there are some ways that there are similarities between Israel and an apartheid state, and then there are many ways that there are dissimilarities between Israel and as an apartheid state. What are your thoughts?
I largely agree with that. I think it's an interesting question that demands a nuanced answer. I certainly think that if you look at Israel pre 1967, which was sort of the area where my mom lived and my relatives still live, I think that the apartheid accusation is a little hyperbolic. you know, you've got plenty of Arabs who are doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and they go to the same theaters, the same beaches, the same parks. Yeah, they go to different schools, but they speak different languages and have different religions, as well. So that sort of makes sense. They live in different types of homes because the Arab Israelis live in extended families, so it's like fewer units but bigger. There are differences. Now, yeah, there is discrimination certainly, like sort of for them to buy land or get building permits. I think it is probably discriminatory, maybe with plausible deniability. All the land is owned by the Jewish National Fund rather than the Israeli government. So the Israeli government can say, well, we're not the ones who are discriminating. So there are various legal ruses that are used. But at the end of the day, I think apartheid certainly goes too far. I think it's too different from what happened in South Africa in too many ways to make that applicable. I think as far as the West Bank, I think it's largely accurate in that, yeah, you have two legal systems, two groups with two different legal sets of rights. Um, and when it comes to distribution of water or land or any other kinds of public decisions, certainly the Jews are going to be at an advantage. So yeah, I think in that regard, it's fairly similar. It's different in certain respects. I don't think there's the racial element. You have Jews of all skin tones, all the way from sub-Saharan Africans to people who are indistinguishable from Western or Northern Europeans. So I don't think there's not like a racial thing. Like we can't be in this kind of racialized disgust that emerged in the U.S. South and maybe the U.S. generally and other places. It's not all that. It's different in that way. It's different from South Africa in that respect. But at the end of the day, from the Palestinian perspective, they would certainly, the similarities would certainly loom much much larger than the differences. So yeah, apply it to the West Bank. I think that's accurate, and I mean, it is true. Like certain things like the blockading of Gaza, all those checkpoints in the West Bank, that was a response to Palestinian terrorism. Like it was not always that hard to get around or to get into Israel. but but that's also the result of Israel's settlement policy and intransigence generally. So uh, at the end of the day, I would not make too big of a fuss of somebody who described the occupied territories as apartheid.
And Gaza is often described as an open air prison. Again, I think that's a strong exaggeration. It's hyperbolic. I can understand why people would say that and feel that, but I would wager that these are people who've not spent much time in a real prison. So I don't think it's a pleasant place to live, Gaza, but it's quite far from literally living in an open air prison. In some ways, it's more like living under a highly restrictive state such as Australia during a time of influenza, COVID influenza, where you couldn't walk more than 5 kilometers from your home, or you may not be allowed to leave your house for more than an hour. There are all sorts of states with very severe COVID restrictions that went, far above anything experienced by anyone in the United States, but places in Europe and Australia. And so to Gaza, it seems to me, is far on a literal level from an open air prison, but Israel does have sovereignty over the water and a lot of what comes in and what goes out. So I would see that description of Gaza as an open air prison as hyperbolic and an exaggeration to make a point. I have some sympathy for it, even though I don't think in the final analysis it's accurate.
I mean, I think probably that comparison. I'm sure it obscures a lot. I think probably that metaphor is invoked to illustrate the idea that Israel can exercise control over it, notwithstanding that it's not physically present, within it, in just the same way that in a prison, the guards can occupy only a very small fraction of the total space and have little involvement in the minutia of what happens in, like, cells or rec rooms or wherever, and yet still be ultimately in charge. Though there are certain way. I mean, you could also say, well, people in open air prisons, they don't get bombed, because of the misbehavior of certain individuals. In that respect, I guess it's more egregious. Again, as I said, it's not. I don't think that the blockade or the restrictions were imposed, completely, gratuitously. And at the end of the day, Israel always has the argument, we are not dealing with, pragmatic actors here that have a religious ideology, and at the end of the day, for a lot of the Gazans, and probably for a lot of the Gazans who either participated in the October 7th attack or rejoice in it, the question of, like, are we occupied or are we not? Are we something else? May not have been the most pressing questions, because they look across the fence. A lot of the Gazans are refugees from pre-1948 Israel, and a lot of them lived in southern Israel, in just those areas of the villages and kibbutzim that were attacked. So for them, like, do you want to call this occupation or a prison or something else? In their minds, that's our home. We're being kept out of it. That's kept away from it. That's the preeminent, fact, regardless of the characterizations. But at the end of the day, I mean, for Gaza, the Palestinians have given Israel, the resounding arguments, because they say you control all these things, you control our borders and so forth. But again, these are people who, in principle, would see any kind of compromise as a betrayal of their religious principles. So Israel it cannot be faulted for refusing to negotiate with them, and for presuming that any promises by them are illusory. So yeah, the Gaza is it is a conundrum.
Now, some people view the Arab-Israeli conflict as primarily a religious conflict. I would see it in terms as primarily a tribal conflict, just as I would primarily understand the Northern Ireland conflict is primarily a tribal conflict. They're not really killing each other over, various definitions of the path to salvation. What do you think? Primarily tribal, primarily religious?
I think historically, certainly tribal. The original Zionists were not particularly religious. A lot of them were atheist communists. Um, I think that certainly the Islam in old Palestine, I don't think they were fanatical Muslims. They seem to they lived fairly peacefully among the minority of Christians and Jews in Ottoman Palestine. So religion certainly did not, I don't think it played a founding role. But is it becoming that, or if it hasn't become that yet, could it become that? I think the answer to that is unfortunately yes. I mean, obviously, these conditions have bred a certain degree of fanaticism among the Palestinians, as you see in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and likewise among the Israelis. Until after the 73 Yom Kippur War, it was all a secular leadership with fairly little heed paid to the religious, but the justifications for Israel's existence and for its actions became ever more religious after that, and the religious nationalists, um, modern Orthodox, I mean, they certainly produce more children than do secular Israelis. The ultra Orthodox, even though originally they're not supposed to be Zionist even, but they will side with that group. They're having more and more kids, and to the extent they're not politically apathetic, they're probably more likely to become right wing. So I think it's moving in a direction where, I mean, I guess at its core, you could say it's still tribal, but the religious elements will make the resolution of the tribal problem all that much harder.
And what are your favorite sources of information about the war? One thing that men like to do is, we like to match, our sources of information with other people's sources of information, and we usually take great pride in having the most accurate and profound sources of information as opposed to other people's meretricious sources of information. So, where do you get your information about this conflict?
Well, as with other things, I try to ensure that I get a variety of things. So, I will read, foreign policy, foreign affairs, and then I'll read right wing stuff like National Review, but I'll also read, Jacobin and New Republic on the other end, and current affairs, and likewise, watching videos. Yeah, I obviously want to know the mainstream view, but I'll listen to Palestinians like Rashid Khalidi and others, as well as various Israeli positions. So I try to I mean, there's disadvantages to that approach. You see too much nuance. I'm not quite sure who bombed the hospital, whether intentionally or by accident. But I try not to get sucked in,
Yeah.
funnelized into one perspective. I mean, both sides are capable of lying. That's for sure.
Now, the thing that most surprised me about this latest war is how inept the IDF was in their response on October 7th, that took them 10 hours at times to get to the places where Hamas militants were still in
Yeah.
control of communities. It took them 5 days to expel and finish all the fighting inside of Israel, that Hamas could just pour in I thought Israel was a much more where citizens had, much more access to guns and had them at hand, and we
Right.
just see Hamas just pouring in, and they take out a cell phone tower, and then they take out a military base. The
Right.
soldiers are still in bed. They just wipe them out. They pour into various Jewish settlements, and there's very little self-defense by the Jews. They overwhelmingly just get slaughtered. I was just shocked at how inept the Israeli defenses were, the IDF, the security apparatus, the slow response. That just took me aback. And when you see such ineptness,
Mhm.
I never think this is just one off. This is just a problem for October 7. I have to believe that there's a rottenness and a lack of expertise and a lack of diligence and a lack of uh, competence all through the Israeli security apparatus and political apparatus. And I would suspect that because a large part of the Israeli government does not believe in secular education, and they are for funding Haredim to avoid national service and to avoid secular education, that this strikes me as like the most incompetent Israeli government that we've ever had. And I'm right wing, so I'm pleased that it's right wing. I'm not pleased that it's so incompetent. The incompetence of the Israeli response to these attacks has just done me. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Haredim are, of course, a big problem. I mean, I think they're parasites. I know that might be seen as anti-Semitic, but I mean, they don't contribute anything, and they siphon off, the budget, and they don't contribute. So, them, they got special privileges at the inception of the state, but at that point, it was a few years after the Holocaust. You only had 400 of them. So, like, of course, we're going to original Jewish learning and give them the privileges they need to do that. But of course, now they're like a much bigger percentage of the population. It's not at all the same thing. But as to your larger point, yeah, I mean that is, yeah, I mean the original image of the Spartan Israeli, a true fighter, um, kind of a communitarian. That's the original Israel. I don't know that may be accurate for the times, but the fact is that over the years, Israel has become richer and richer. Its technological and economic and geopolitical advantages over its rivals have only increased. Right now, I mean, the per capita GDP of Israel is higher than Germany's.
Wow.
Where 40 years ago it was still a developing country. So I think, yeah, I think there's probably a certain fear in the heart of of Israelis, that sort of their fiber, their character, however you choose to characterize it, is sort of being undermined by the very success as a country, you know. Um, and conversely, you put Palestinians in a I have nothing to lose situation. Well, that's bound to breed a certain fortitude. Um, and so that's, I think, I don't know the details of why certain systems didn't work or why certain assumptions and not others were made. We'll know that in time when there's an investigation, and hopefully the Netanyahu regime is ejected. But we can speak in broad strokes, at least right now. And yeah, it's the arrogance and hubris of success. We've prevailed over the Arabs, again and again with this high tech superpower. Yeah, it's sort of the arrogance of success, the enervating effects of prosperity, perhaps as well. that's kind of, I think that's a dilemma, any kind of, you know, that just like comes, that's just a natural concomitant of Israel's success in so many spheres, is that its original self art image as these like Spartan, hyper competent warriors gets undermined.
And Israelis were, almost at each other's throats 2.5 weeks ago prior to this attack. It just been convulsed by the Netanyahu administration's desire for reconfiguring the Israeli judicial system. And so, do you think that this controversy and attention over the Israeli judicial system, it had to have sucked time away? There's only so much time in the day. I'll be very honest. I don't think about Palestinian suffering. It's not because I view them as any less human, any less valuable in God's eyes. It's just I have a limited amount of time. I have a high intensity commitment to Orthodox Judaism, and so most of my care and concern goes to those commitments and not to what's going on with out groups. If you got the people running Israel who are convulsed by controversy over the judicial system, that is time in a zero-sum section that you are not thinking about, keeping Israel safe from external attack. Any thoughts?
That may be the case. I think we'll have to wait to find out what the ultimate explanation is. So, yeah, it's possible, as you suggest, that the leadership was so consumed with these other issues that when intelligence officials came forth with reasons for concern, they just disregarded it. That's certainly possible. It's also possible that in setting up these various censor systems, people were very overconfident, underestimating the Palestinians' ability to innovate. Certainly, it's beyond the distractedness. There's also the slavish. I mean, one of the issues that soldiers who should have been guarding southern Israel from Gaza were in the West Bank protecting settlers, and their big festivities, which I would suspect were calculated to provoke the Palestinians. So that in the mind of secular Israel is just it highlights what's wrong with the Netanyahu administration with Smotrich and Ben Gvir and that ilk. At the end of the day, you have to say, Israel's attacks on Gaza are justified with the refrain, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course, nobody, no reasonable person disputes that except for the hard left. But it was Israel itself that failed to exercise that right in failing to prevent October 7th. It's not as though, had the IDF and the intelligence agencies been functioning properly, had enough soldiers been where they should have been, easily Israel would have been able to repel even 1,500 Hamas fighters. It's not like Hamas was such an overwhelming force. It was because of the Israeli incompetence. But now, of course, there's the guilt and shame over the incompetence, the desire to expiate the incompetence, and so now, well, we have to destroy Hamas. We have to even at a huge civilian toll because of our right to defend ourselves. But it's a performative enactment of that right, because the right to defend themselves should have been on October 7th. It should have been with competent preparation, and certainly the Netanyahu administration and all their ilk, they have every incentive to try to channel the public's fury away from themselves towards Gaza. They know that the instant this war ends, whatever that is, however the situation, then the fury of the public turns on them. So they want to direct as much fury towards the Palestinians, hoping at least some of that fury dissipates before it has to turn back on them. I mean, the bombing of Gaza will not bring back the victims of October 7th. Only competent management could have done that by preventing it, but it was not prevented, and that's ultimately at the feet of Netanyahu. Whatever the precise explanation, whether it be distraction or arrogance or uh, obsequiousness to the hard religious settler, right? Whatever the explanation, as Truman says, the buck stops here. It stops with Netanyahu.
Now, I was surprised after 9/11 that there wasn't more revulsion among Americans at America's entanglement with Israel and with the Middle East that seemed to have precipitated the 9/11 attacks. You surprised that Americans didn't revolt at what I would understand as unnecessary levels of American involvement in the Middle East that precipitated these 9/11 attacks and precipitate unnecessary Arab Islamic loathing of the United States in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to say, what is the source of the Islamist loathing of the U.S. I mean, you could say, well, is it its support for Israel? I'm not. I suppose that's probably part of it. Though I think Bin Laden. I mean, his official, at least the 91 attack on the World Trade Center, or 93, like the parking lot bombing that preceded it, and I think 9/11 as well. I mean, they didn't like the idea that you had U.S. troops on Islamic soil. I mean, so the formal justification I don't think had that much to do for with Israel, but Israel's kind of a lightning rod in the sense that I think for a lot of these Islamists, I mean, it is the problem is that this decadent Christian civilization is ascendant over the true faith, Islamic civilization, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an emanation of that. Insofar as Israel, though not consisting in Christians, are still kind of an emanation of the Western European culture, the Western culture. So you certainly have those people. I mean, would 9/11 not have happened if, I mean, this was the time, I think, really, like, right after the end of the peace talks, after the collapse of Oslo in Camp David. I don't know if all of the Muslims world's problems with modernity can be reduced to U.S. support for Israel. I mean, but I think even like U.S. support for Israel, I mean, it's significant certainly, but it gets exaggerated in the public eye. Like, a lot of people think that the entire Israeli economy is on life support sustained by the United States. That's really not the case. You have they get $3.8 billion a year, which is certainly a sizable chunk of change, no question. But you've got a GDP of $500 billion. It's less than 1% of the GDP. It's not like Israel couldn't do anything without U.S. support. U.S. Became a big supporter of Israel only really after the '67 war. Um, so I think you look at human nature. You've got to people are driven by their hero systems, but in justifying the actions that their hero systems require, they can't forthrightly acknowledge those hero systems because that highlights their contingency. So you always need some sort of pragmatic or pseudo pragmatic explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. And with the Islamists, it's the U.S. support for Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. And I'm not going to say there's no, I'm not going to say that's played no role. But I think again, if you have a sophisticated human psychology, then you've got to be suspicious. Maybe there's certain underlying drives, and to justify those consciously, you need to seize on certain things that are available for use. So not that U.S. actions have no effect, but whatever effect they have, is refracted through culture and religion and history.
Now, at Harvard University, I think the day after the attacks, or maybe even the day of the
Yeah.
attacks, about 25 student groups immediately came out with a statement saying that the entire blame for these Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians, which we now know killed over 1,400 or taken over 250 hostages, that the entire blame lies with Israel. So that doesn't raise my blood pressure one beat, because these people are just acting out of their hero system in a time of war and conflict. I would expect people to just instinctively side with their side. I don't see these people as really trying to communicate that slaughtering civilians is okay. They are in a time of conflict just immediately siding with their team. It also doesn't raise my blood pressure one beat that then various billionaires said, well, we want these students' names so that we can blacklist them from ever being employed. I think that's a perfectly valid, rational response. Then the names of many of these students were publicly revealed, and photos were put up on, say, a truck that drove around the Harvard campus.
Yeah, I
That
remember
doesn't
that.
yeah, that doesn't bother me. If you want to take a controversial stand, then I don't care if your name and photo is released. Now, if someone punched someone for writing that letter, let alone any more, physical attack, a criminal assault like that, then that would raise my blood pressure. I would be opposed and appalled at that. But prior to the committing of any criminal behavior, I think I'm A-OK with how all sides acted. One side immediately rushing to identify with their team, then the other side immediately rushing to make sure that they inflict as much legal pain on the other side as they can. So any thoughts on the Harvard controversy?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, there's been a lot of criticism of various left wing groups saying, they have they're openly sympathetic to Hamas. They celebrate the massacre of October 7th, and that is certainly that's an accurate characterization of certain statements or symbolic gestures by certain groups. I agree that with Harvard, it was a little more nuanced than that. There's an Israel is responsible for this entire situation and therefore for the actions of Hamas. That's not quite the same thing as celebrating the atrocities. So I guess I wouldn't. I probably wouldn't put things the way they did, but I would distinguish between that kind of causal explanation and actual celebration of the atrocities. As far as the truck that went around Harvard and publicized their name, well, I think as long as you are accurately characterizing um, what they said, I think that's okay. If you quote the exact letter or the relevant or representative portion thereof, and you say, well, these people signed under that, Yeah, that's perfectly fine. If you say like they celebrate the Hamas attacks, and you list their names. Well, I mean that's potentially defamatory. I mean we can certainly have that as an interpretation of their statements, but that is just an interpretation. You have to actually, if you're going to accuse them of that, you do have to provide you have to demonstrate concretely what exactly they said, and then everybody can form their own opinion about what that means. So yeah, with those caveats, I don't get easily outraged either.
Right. I mean, all sides pretty much acting within the law are completely understandable. Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences of your speech. These
Right.
are adults. These aren't 13-year-olds, right? So, uh, do you see possibilities for much wider conflict here, or do you think this is going to be pretty limited?
Um, I that will be in the hands of Israel to a significant extent. I mean, this can't be a year-long war. I mean, if only for Israel's sake, if for no other reason. Um, there's one argument out there. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but it sounds reasonable to me that Hezbollah and Iran knew the extent, more or less knew the extent of Israel's reaction to the strike, and so if their goal was to enter the war against Israel, why not do it on October 7th when Israel was at its weakest, rather than now when it's ready. Um, you know, so far, yeah, okay, Hezbollah, they fire a few rockets here and there, a few shells here and there. That's to be expected, but no indications that they actually want to escalate. You know, um, they would Lebanon would be devastated if there was an escalation. Yeah, they had certain successes in the 2006 war. Israel didn't perform that well in certain respects, but at the end of the day, Israel has more and better bombs. That's kind of, well, it's a lot of what it comes down to. So I'm not, I'm moderately worried. I don't think a conflagration is inevitable. Though, who knows? Things change from day to day. I could change my mind by next week.
So a very common part of the American hero system is that people are individuals. They should be judged and only punished as individuals. But the way the world works is that we're not primarily seen, none of us primarily seen as individuals.
Uh,
We're primarily
right.
seen as representatives of tribes and groups. And groups suffer, groups get punished and groups get rewarded. So we have a Jewish state, ergo, all Jews everywhere in the world are going to be more of a target for people who are displeased with the actions of a Jewish state than if there was no Jewish state. So
Mhm.
we have the theoretical ideal, particularly in America and other Anglo nations, that people are primarily individuals. That's also the classical liberal notion, to bring it back to your book. But that's not the way the world usually works. People are not primarily seen as individuals. They are primarily seen as members of tribes and
Right.
nations. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I mean that's why it was possible for Hamas to do what it did. Uh, that's why it was possible for the no less than the president of Israel, to Herzog, to say, well, there's this distinction between Palestinian militants and civilians is really kind of bogus. They're all implicated. Yeah, that is our evolutionary default mechanism. That's what works in the ancestral environment, and that remains a powerful impulse to this day, notwithstanding our attempts to restrain that impulse and see people as individuals, which is I agree it is a kind of uh, an artificial civilizational imposition, something that runs against our default instincts, and you see that, you see its artificiality precisely in these times of stress and fear and uncertainty, such as we're now witnessing.
Right, and another part of that individualist liberal outlook is that meaning, purpose, and morality can be decided by the buffered individual, separate from everybody else. And the traditional perspective is that we are not primarily individuals; we're primarily members of tribes and nations, and that meaning, purpose, and morality exist outside of ourselves, and it is our duty to, fulfill the dictates of the group, the tribe, the nation, the religion, the entity of which we are just one part, exists outside of us, and it lists out what is meaningful, what is purposeful, what is heroic, what is right and wrong, and I mean, that is how the people in this war are experiencing things. They are not individually, by and large, making up their own meaning and purpose and definition of what's heroic and right. They are almost all buying into their different group hero systems. And so conflicts like this, someone at synagogue asked me when this was going down, is tell me something good that comes out of this conflict. And I said, well, it returns us to reality, and part of reality is that we inherit our hero system from our group, and that without our group, without our ties to other people, we are not we. Like, we are unknowable without, outside of our tribe or our group, generally speaking. And so it just kind of the corporate inherent corporate response to events of great conflict and tension, like this Israel versus Hamas war, kind of reveal so much of the inadequacy and the shortcomings of the classical liberal Enlightenment view that we are primarily individuals who can decide meaning and morality and heroism all by our lonesomes.
Yeah, for sure. I can sit here in this conversation and articulate the Arab side of things in I think a reasonable and a charitable way, and acknowledge where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, if as I mentioned, my family is in the middle of Israel, and if war breaks out with Hezbollah, I will want the Israeli Air Force to inflict as much damage as is necessary on Lebanon to stop that. you know, and you can have your, calculations of, utilitarianism and human rights and all that. But yeah, we've got these primitive attachments to the group. And yeah, again, as I said, yeah, they can be subdued to a certain extent, but they're always going to be there. Now, I mean, does that mean that because it's in some way our default state, let's concede it's kind of, so our original state, it kind of feels right, it gets our dopamine going. I mean, does that mean it cannot be restrained to any extent? Well, obviously it has been to a significant extent. So what are we? I guess I would throw that back at you. Like, even if I agree that this traditionalist view in some way better acknowledges, better encapsulates our default human nature, certainly our default human nature is not all we are. Also,
Yeah, I agree with that. There are many benefits to the liberal, buffered, rational, strategic, autonomous sense of self, because precisely when I go on a live stream and critique the liberal, buffered, rational, autonomous, strategic sense of self, I am operating from within a largely liberal, strategic, buffered, autonomous sense of self when I critique it, because I try to do these live streams from as objective and strategic and autonomous sense of self as possible. So there are many life situations where the liberal conception of the self is simply more adaptive. If you're going to be a professional working in corporate America or in academia, there are all sorts of areas of life where a liberal conception of self will better serve you than a trad sense of self. I am not going to stand here and publicly say words which could forever haunt me from my embodied, tribal self. That would be a disaster.
Yeah. So what was I going to say?
Am I feeling myself? Can I feel like I could move in and out somewhat of the strategic, autonomous, reflexive, liberal, conception of the self, and which I kind of put on when I'm doing a live stream. I don't choose my words as carefully when I'm with friends at synagogue. There, I'm having a much more embodied tribal experience of life. So, do you think I'm fooling myself that one can move, somewhat in and out of these different senses of the self?
Right. Well, so I guess I would say that in a sense, when I think about what drove me to write conservative claims of cultural oppression, it wasn't to endorse conservative traditionalism per se, but to make resistance to liberalism comprehensible.
Yeah.
Which was itself a liberal aspiration. Like, it is seen as this obtuse, malice coming out of nowhere. But it does come from somewhere. Whatever your ultimate moral calculus may be, it does come from somewhere, or our default human nature. And you've got, which, people may or may not, suspend to various degrees depending on their social position, but you've got to understand that's where it's coming from. And in the same way that liberals are, they're very understanding, why is there a higher black crime rate? Well, they'll list, the various historical and social explanations for it. And, any kind of bad decision or counterproductive behavior, which the underprivileged might make, they'll have a ready causal explanation, which may be accurate in many cases. But there was an unwillingness to extend that same level of understanding to conservatives, and their condition is our default human nature, which is just like weighs heavier in some people than others for whatever random reasons that might explain that. Doesn't really matter. And so again, it was to make this kind of liberal bleeding heart understanding to extend that to conservatives. And where you go from that, that people can judge that for themselves.
So I feel like I can move out of a more or no reflexive sense of self. For example, I had a girlfriend who, while we were having sex, she would sometimes implore me to fuck her like a whore. And so I would. And so I had no reflexive sense. I quit caring about her and what she wanted in any way. I just purely indulged my own animal passions. I completely moved out of any reflexive, compassionate, conversational, mutual sense of self. I was just a beast. So do we have the capacity to move out of, various senses of self? On the other hand, when I'm doing this show now, I think about what would my friends at synagogue say? What would my family say? What would, my clients say? What would strangers on a bus say if they, saw this video and then they, met me at a restaurant or a coffee shop, or some woman that I might date, 3 months from now? So right now I have a highly reflexive sense of self. I try to see myself from the outside and how my words can be interpreted by different people in different situations. I have a courteous
Yeah.
sense of morality as I speak to you, but there are plenty of times in my life where I completely lose that courteous sense of morality, that reflexive sense of self, and I just have, a primal embodied experience. What do you think? Do we move out of these different senses of self?
Well, I guess I mean that would be the ideal, right? That sort of since as we can't deny this animal nature, can we at least funnel it or channel it in a productive way? And I guess I mean I would think to the extent this is sort of this mode of relationship is agreed upon. That's like a classic. That kind of illustrates the ideal of, well, we're not at some level. Of course, we're bound by these moral principles. They've become part of us, but so too is our ancestry. And I guess your example is an example of the two being coordinated in a manageable fashion. So I would have no problem with that.
And also, if I were primarily spending my time in an academic environment, I would take on more of the academic liberal understanding of self, as opposed to if I were primarily spending my time among Orthodox Jews, I would take on more of a traditional sense of self. I mean, we do change. I had periods of my life where I was quite left wing when I was at college, and I must have unconsciously taken on the perspective of this disembodied, reflexive, buffered sense of self, and then in other environments reverted to a more tribal sense of self. So it is entirely possible for people to move out in and out depending on the situations that they place themselves in, because we all want to get along, we all want to be successful, we all want to feel a part of things, and if the only way to feel a part of things is to take on a particular orientation to life, we're highly incentivized to do that.
Yeah, well, that's being buffered and reflexive and disengaged is kind of a privilege. It's something that you are we can do in certain circumstances, but maybe not others, and maybe not most. And that's some people are going to be in a situation where they can be buffered 80% of the time, but others not at all. And exactly there, that's this resentment, I guess, against the elites. You have people who live in such a way, privileged to live in such a way they can be continuously buffered, and it's still a source of meaning. And then whenever they see others sort of surrendering to something more primitive, in whatever context, um, less reflexive, they scoff at it, but they are privileged to do so.
Right. Okay. Any final words? Anything that you want to hit before we wrap up for today?
I think I'm good, but we should reconvene in a while. See, updates to the war, updates to SBF when they arise.
Sounds good. Okay.